Following the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world seemed poised for an entirely democratic future, one in which all nations from the post-Soviet Eastern Bloc to the so-called Third World would see the social and political benefits of mass democratization. While such a trend did hold true during the 1990s and 2000s, today's world has yet again seen a movement towards authoritarianism, with 2019 seeing the world return to a state in which democracy was no longer the majority government structure. However, when analyzing the current state of democratic erosion, and especially when viewing the status of democratic governments on the African continent, Ghana seems to be an interesting anomaly. As seen on the measurement of Freedom House, the nation is a bright spot of green, free nations in an ocean of surrounding partially and not free nations that pervade the African continent. A country that, while surrounded by authoritarian and unstable military governments across the region, has maintained robust liberal institutions, free and fair elections, and an organized civil society. Researching further, the democratic status of Ghana today was something fought for and hardly won over decades since independence, and an ongoing experiment in its most recent form since 1992. Such a discussion of Ghana's political movement towards democracy and the ever-present vulnerabilities to its democratic future allow for a comprehensive analysis of the standards needed for a nation to be considered a democracy generally, and how Ghana specifically performs in that regard, by not only being able to relish but also criticize the health of democratic regimes like those in Ghana, is our current understanding of what conditions are needed to perpetuate and expand democracy's culture worldwide made clear, but also what criteria is needed to measure what makes a democracy at large successful. For my first criteria of the 4 essential standards I believe a nation needs to uphold in order for a democracy in that nation to be established, I chose to focus on the peaceful transition of power resulting from a free and fair election. At its basest element, even the most minimal of democratic definitions, as defined by Joseph Schumpeter in his 1942 Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and as seen in the electoral definition of democracy, involved the principle of free, fair, and competitive elections. Before the procedural, participatory, and social definitions of democracy expand on the governing institutions within the nation and social liberties guaranteed to the population, as discussed in Professor Griffith's lecture, the centrality of elections, the ability of a nation to hold an open election process with competitive political parties jockeying for opposing candidates, and a universal franchise for adult citizens able to have input in that decision is a necessity. Free and fair elections are the backbone of all democratic definitions in both the minimalist and maximalist traditions. However, more than just the institution of an electoral system being established and the results respected by the opposition in a competitive race, is the continuity of such a democratic system. Can the institutions of that country be relied upon to repeat the free and fair process of elections across time? And what institutional barriers are there preventing popular manipulation of the elected results? The criteria for the peaceful transition of power between administrations as a result of free and fair elections matters, because at its most basic core, democracy compared to authoritarianism must involve the expansion of political power and decision-making away from a small group of elites. If the people are able to separate the will of the elites and at times even actively go against the desires of elites for a certain elected, is the most basic step of democracy secured. Secondly, I believe that a democracy must contain checks and balances on the power of the executive. In order for a democracy to differentiate itself from an authoritarian regime, means to standardize the power held by and excluded from the executive branch. By limiting the power of the executive through other institutions like the legislature and an independent judiciary, can the potential for the concentration of power to one individual, as it does in an authoritarian regime, be made more difficult. The willingness of a government and executive to adhere to a rule of law is paramount to the establishment of the diffusion of power necessary for a republic of and by the people to exist. By establishing a rule of law, most normally upheld by a constitution, are the limits and abilities of the executive made the most clear, and when subject to the challenges by a judiciary, is the benchmark for what actions a president might take that fall out of their jurisdiction and may require legal action to stop them regulated. or in the most extreme cases, to remove them. The fact that checks and balances on the executive can result in the removal of an executive emphasizes the diffusion of power away from the top authority and towards other direct decision-making of legislative leaders, who are the people's most direct representatives. For my third standard of democracy, I consider the strength of the protections for minority or traditionally underserved communities within a country. While a constitution may also establish the strength of a democracy's institutions, the people's guarantees for unconditional individual rights are a reflection of the government's unwavering commitment to democratic principles. When rights are able to be systematically or arbitrarily stripped from any population within a country, such action opens the opportunity for future populations to also be attacked, simply because a precedent for disenfranchisement has already been established. For example, as discussed in Professor Griffith's lecture, legal protections for the rights of pedophiles or those accused of sexual assault, especially against minors, can be considered a key indicator of a country's appetite for democratic governance. Because even if the most despicable people can be provided a fair trial and equal protections under the law, a proper legal system has successfully been implanted within that nation. The state now has successfully monopolized the legitimate use of force instead of mob rule. The protections afforded to minority communities is crucial as a criteria for the stability of democracy because the acceptance or at least tolerance of those different from the majority legitimizes other democratic processes, like the universality of elections. When the majority population of a nation is able to erase the civil liberties of any other group of people without due process, the ability of a nation to consider itself a democracy, even under the minimalist definition of free, fair, and competitive elections, becomes irrelevant. Finally, I look to analyze the general support for democratic institutions amongst a population of a country as my last standard of democracy. Many scholars argue that further than just the presence of democratic institutions and constitutional provisions for the establishment of a democracy, democratic principles must be actively upheld and believed in by the citizens of a country in order for that nation to be considered a legitimate democracy. By transitioning democratic criteria from simple guarantees on paper or legal doctrine to inform to instead consider tangible results and dedication amongst the populace to a tolerable society that allows for differences to exist is the real test of a democracy made clear. Are the substantive results of a democracy's execution as robust as its founding documents claim it should be? More than just listing of 4 criteria, these 4 standards of democracy should be taken in unison when evaluating a nation's democratic performance. While a nation may hold dear 1 or 2 of these preferences, it is the unique combination of all 4 criteria that are necessary for an entirely robust and stable democratic regime, one that sees decision-making in the hands of the people, complete power kept away from the executive, protections for vulnerable communities established, and the people's belief in democratic governance upheld. When first evaluating Ghana's place as a stable democracy as evaluated by my 4 criteria, it must be said that Ghana's record of free and fair elections is quite impressive when compared to how recently its democracy was established. In 1957, Ghana was given a historic opportunity for change as the first sub-Saharan nation given independence from a colonial power. Ghana would then fall under the leadership of Pan-African advocate Kwame Nkrumah, who would serve as the nation's first prime minister and in 1960 would be inaugurated as the first president of the First Republic of Ghana. However, following a stream of increasingly despotic actions by Nkrumah, his government would be overthrown in 1966 by General Joseph Ankara in a military coup. Ankara would hold power for 3 years before resigning as leader, enabling his successor to re-establish an elected government in 1969. However, from 1969 to 1981, Ghana would undergo a period of alternating control between military coups and elected governments, as individual military leaders jockeyed for power and failed to centralize the legitimate authority. Finally, however, in 1981, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings of the Ghanaian Air Force would ultimately overthrow a newly restored elected government and rule for 11 years as the nation's de facto leader before his own move to restore constitutional democracy in 1992. A new era of Ghanaian democracy would now begin under his rule, that saw a constitution reestablished, ratified, and elections held. Returning to my criteria, since 1992, there has remained an unbroken chain of elected leaders to represent the Ghanaian government over the course of 9 elections, one every 4 years. The nation has witnessed the election of 5 different presidents, including Jerry Rawlings serving 2 terms, since the founding of the 4th Ghanaian Republic, and 4 turnovers of power between 2 major political parties of the nation, Rawlings' own National Democratic Congress, NDC, and the oppositional New Patriotic Party, NPP. Every election since 1992 has been deemed largely free and fair by independent and international observers, while minor inconsistencies with election legitimacy, such as the buying of political votes by executives and their campaigns, have existed since 1992 and do remain a constant threat to the continued future of legitimate elections. Ghana's repeated legacy of elections has been the most important step in transforming Ghana from a country where democratic norms are considered transitional to one where democracy is fully entrenched. However, Ghana's electoral system does face many threats to its continued legitimacy, namely the independence of the Electoral Commission, EC, the constitutionally mandated body of Ghana to process electoral reforms, and a body appointed by the president. Because the 4-year elections are the main authority in determining the balance of power in Ghanaian politics, such a quote-unquote winner-take-all system is highly favored by the party in power, limiting their willingness to engage in any kind of election reform that could hamper their grasp on power. In essence, even if the EC had identified a key vulnerability in election results, or had engaged in fraud, corruption, or any other horrible criteria that could result in expulsion, it would be in the vested interest of the president and his administration to ignore such reforms, or to remove such an official, as such an act allows the opposition party the opportunity to pounce on the next election cycle, promising those same reforms. Furthermore, the fact that the political landscape remains dominated by both the NPP and the NDC is something that is largely attributed to the financial barriers placed in front of new political parties before registering their party, totaling hundreds of thousands of Ghanaian cedi, their currency, to register a political party, and a few thousand Ghanaian cedi to register as a possible candidate for the parliament, insulating the ability of outside challengers to pose credible threats to the electoral machines that the NDC and the NPP have become in the election process. When analyzing the current state of checks and balances in Ghana, by analyzing the willingness of President Jerry Rawlings to adhere to the 2-term congressional constitutional limit of a president, the 2-term limit of a constitution he essentially forged himself, the former dictator of Ghana took the first step in consolidating Ghana's respect for the democratic criteria of a peaceful transition of power and legitimacy of the Constitution's checks and balances, by not only allowing himself to step down and be replaced by his vice president as the candidate for his own NDC party, and even more importantly, in allowing for the successful election of the opposition NPP party in 2000, President Rawlings ignored and dismissed the intersection of the opportunity, incentive, and ability to reestablish authoritarian rule in Ghana. Such an action consolidates the legitimacy of Ghanaian democracy with its first major electoral challenge, moving away from the man who established the 1992 Constitution and towards creating a system that will and has outlived him, most importantly setting a precedent for future executives to follow. The 2012 and 2020 elections of Ghana also saw 2 important moves towards the role of the Supreme Court in establishing itself as a body meant to legitimize the democratic authority of the state. The 2012 election of incumbent President John Mahama was hotly contested, with the opposition NPP filing a petition to allege fraud in the election, with the Supreme Court denying such a petition. Such a predicament was repeated in 2020, yet this time with the NDC filing a petition of fraud against the NPP that was again rejected. These stress tests are crucial to ensuring the ability of the judiciary to check and authorize executive authority. Such a respect for the established constitutional rule of law for how to manage elections rather than resorting to violence to resolve political disputes are a key element of the strength of Ghana's democracy today. However, one threat to the status of checks and balances remains the close relationship between the parliament and the executive branch. Under Article 78 of the Ghanaian Constitution, ministers of state, a position appointed by the president to his cabinet, must be selected from within the members of parliament. This means that MPs of the party in power often have a vested interest in abiding by the demands and authority of the president, as ministers of state is a much more prestigious and lucrative elected position compared to an MP. Such a dual position in both the executive and legislative branch largely stagnates the MP's ability to oppose presidential action or conduct their constitutionally required oversight authorities over the president, as any such oversight or future reforms could also affect their personal power. Next, when analyzing the status of the legal protections of minority rights in Ghana, the rights of women and the LGBTQ community are an especially tenuous subject in the nation, and as such will be used as a key qualitative proxies for the overall health of minority protections in Ghana. Firstly, although the Constitution does provide for equality on the basis of gender, women still face persistent struggles in reaching legal equality with men, especially when trying to achieve equal representation in Parliament. While bills such as the Affirmative Action Act of 2024 do provide pathways for equitable representation of women in Parliament by 2030, alongside more stringent financial and criminal penalties for private entities that do not abide by non-discrimination laws against women, such a bill has in one form or another been in legislative limbo for the past 30 years, with both political parties using its implementation when their party is out of power as a means to rally popular support, yet repeatedly failing to deliver upon the promises of implementation when elected. How the Affirmative Action Act will be implemented and enforced remains largely to be seen, yet without proper enforcement mechanisms such an act will yet again be another lackluster government effort to actually address historic inequities faced by women. Next, it should sadly come as no surprise that in a nation like Ghana, a highly conservative, majority Christian nation, grapples with the issue of equitable LGBTQ rights. In Ghana, homosexuality is already a crime resulting in jail time. However, to go further in this discriminatory act, different versions of the so-called Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill have been repeatedly considered as a law since 2021, a bill that would criminalize an individual identifying as queer with 3 years of jail time, a prohibition on same-sex marriages, and especially with harder 5 to 10-year prison sentences for any individual vocally supporting the queer community. The fact that this bill was even considered as a viable political position and passed unanimously by the legislature, was constitutionally cleared to proceed by the Supreme Court, and made it to the president's desk awaiting signature, is a key indication of the limitations for democratic thought in Ghana. Ghanaians at large seem to support the denial of fundamental civil rights to communities that are contrary to their mainstream religious and cultural views. Finally, when measuring the general support for democratic institutions in Ghana, I chose to analyze the most recent Round 9 and Round 10 results of the Afrobarometer regarding sentiments of democracy in Ghana. The Afrobarometer is a nonpartisan metric that measures the collection of qualitative data as the questionnaire across multiple topics, namely democratic health, governance, and quality of life. According to their website, Afrobarometer is an independent Pan-African research network that provides data on African citizens' values, evaluations, and experiences, comprising one of the most accurate databases of citizen satisfaction with their government on the continent. Afrobarometer Round 9 and 10 results are the most recent publications, published in 2022 and 2024 respectively, and are key indicators of public opinion of democracy in Ghana in the 33 years since the Fourth Republic's founding. In its most recent publication, the Afrobarometer found that an astounding 82.3% of Ghanaian respondents believe that their nation is quote-unquote going in the wrong direction, a slight decrease in the 87.5% of Ghanaians who gave the same answer in 2022. However, rather than signifying a dramatic improvement in the Ghanaian way of life, its decrease is largely the result of Ghana finally emerging from a macroeconomic lending crisis that was at its height in 2022, emphasizing a return to the status quo rather than a comprehensive improvement of Ghana's approach to successful governance. When analyzing questions related to the health and stability of democratic government in Ghana, similar trends can be found. When compared to past round 2 results of the Afrobarometer taken in 2002, 2022 saw a 54% jump from 28% to 75% of Ghanaian respondents who view themselves as being treated unfairly under the law, alongside an 8% decrease from 89% to 81% of Ghanaian respondents who feel that leaders should be chosen via elections, and a staggering 10% from 8% to 10% of respondents who believe that quote-unquote other methods of choosing leaders should be utilized given the faulty nature of elections. These questionnaires emphasize that while the preferences for democracy in Ghana do remain strong, the decreasing rate of satisfaction can and already has demonstrated to Ghanaians the need to be open to alternative forms of government as democracy continues to disappoint. After evaluating Ghana's existing democratic performance, can the assumption of the future of its democracy be made clear? While Ghana has a legacy of consolidated democratic practices over the past 30 years, this consolidation is threatened by numerous electoral threats and the constant pressure of political elites. Based on the threats I have already analyzed, Ghana's democracy seems tenuous, with a major threat of democratic backsliding unless major reforms are undertaken. Election reform is the most needed barrier to future Ghanaian elections in order to prolong the criteria of a peaceful transition of power under free and fair elections. The Electoral Commission, EC, is among the most highly respected bodies in Ghanaian democracy. However, this body has been routinely criticized for its connections to the executive branch, an appointed position of the president, hampering its legacy as an independent electoral body. Having the ability to appoint the chair of the EC, oppositional voices to the current administration and activists have often described the election process as being in the hands of the incumbent. While the ability to suggest election reform does fall on the EC, when lacking the authority to institutionalize the electoral changes without the approval of the president and majority party, the EC essentially becomes another body of the executive branch. Actions taken to limit the power of the executive in electoral matters are largely ineffective without constitutional reform. Yet the party in power largely does not have an incentive to reform current presidential authority, largely because of the benefits that personal parliamentarians gain from the current system. Lacking serious accountability mechanisms, it is truly a marvel that more serious electoral fraud has not already been waged before. And yet, even if that fraud did exist, a judiciary of Supreme Court justices appointed by the president, an electoral commission appointed by the president, would not be in any rush to halt such an effort. The opportunity for manipulation of Ghana's electoral system has not only been tested before, but without the suggestions of past election reform and election security, as recommended by the Supreme Court, being taken seriously by the executive, the future of Ghanaian elections still remains subject to the whims of one person, opening an opportunity for continued disregard of election norms that prevent the further consolidation of democratic culture in Ghana. Secondly, the patronage system of the Ghanaian political system has and will remain a thorn to the checks and balances of political power. Constitutional provisions themselves pose a threat to the checks and balances on the executive, with the Ghanaian constitution giving outsized authority to the president. Ghana's constitution maintains that half of the president's ministers of state must be appointed from the parliament, meaning that MPs often have an incredible incentive to bow to executive authority in an effort to improve their personal lot. The Ghanaian constitution's preference for executive power gives credence to the fact that any future threats to Ghanaian democracy will likely emerge from an executive coup rather than a traditional classic coup, as a culture of already weak political accountability between executives and the other branches of government just needs to be continuously ignored to challenges to the executive's power. The further insulated the democratic process becomes in Ghana, the more of an opportunity an executive has to further his own reaches of power, as long as they make sure to account for the personal pockets of the elected parliament and their appointed Supreme Court. As long as these concerns are taken care of, what is there to stop an authoritarian leading president from steamrolling established liberal institutions? Next, by examining the dangers posed to populations like the LGBTQ community and women in Ghana, can the future of Ghana's democratic performance under the criteria of the protection for minority rights be evaluated? While it was not signed into law by President Akufo-Addo in 2024, another version of the Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill has already been reintroduced to the current 9th Ghanaian Parliament in 2025. Some scholars, like Dr. Joshua Zato, a political scientist at the University of Ghana, even argue that it was former President Akufo-Addo's unwillingness to sign the bill into law that what cost his NPP party at the polls with a loss during last year's election. While Dr. Zato does bring up valid criticisms regarding the lack of executive follow-through regarding constitutionally and congressionally passed legislation, the fact that this bill is something that explicitly violates the equality of rights of certain Ghanaians and was more than guaranteed to face a challenge of constitutionality if signed into law was not discussed by Dr. Zato. If limitations on the rights of the LGBTQ community in Ghana are popular enough to sway the results of an election, it is no wonder that similar bills of its nature would be reintroduced and popularly supported by the next legislator, even when that legislator is overwhelmingly dominated by an opposing political party, indicating that a bipartisan effort to marginalize the queer community in Ghana into the future is popular nationwide, and a potent political weapon to be wielded by politicians. The current president, John Mahama, himself on November 19th of this year, said in an interview that if a bill of an anti-homosexual nature was passed through Parliament, he would sign it, as he believes marriage in Ghana should be between a man and a woman. If Ghana's future performance on civil rights writ large is represented by governmental attacks against the LGBTQ community, there remains a danger that other vulnerable gender, sexual orientation, religious, and cultural minority groups could face similar pressures. In a nation where traditional gender roles are held in high regard, it would not be difficult to see an erasure of the hard-fought freedoms of the rights of women. And if the current parliamentary record for the enforcement of rules like the Affirmative Action Act are of any indication of the importance that Ghanaian government holds for furthering the political and social independence of women, it would be not surprising to see this landmark act fall into obscurity. Finally, the fact that current projections of the citizenship's belief in democracy and its effectiveness as a governing institution have decreased over the past few decades is a cause for concern in future projections of democratic stability in Ghana. While, as of 2024's Afrobarometer results, demonstrating that 72.8% of Ghanaians still support democracy over quote-unquote any other form of government, if larger and larger minority portions of the population plainly feel that the current institutions are inadequate to addressing current problems or are willing to cede citizen decision-making authority to an executive who can end the corruption of the state, reestablish legitimacy of electoral bodies, and move the population out of its current debt crises, it seems like a growing minority of Ghanaians are willing to accept those terms. In order for Ghana's future of possible democratic backsliding to be averted, and the weakness in Ghana's current democratic system stopped, broad-scale legislative, judicial, and executive reforms are needed. Luckily, Ghana's constitutional system does allow for the process of additional amendments to be made, a process that has already begun in earnest under President John Mahama's new administration. In accordance with his presidential campaign calling for reform to the Constitution, in January 2025, Mahama formed an 8-member Constitutional Review Committee meant to collect public submissions and recommendations for constitutional change, a body that is expected to present its findings to the president within the coming weeks as of the writing of this paper. Mahama's new Patriotic Party, now actually for the first time since 1992, holds a supermajority in the Ghanaian parliament. The constitutionally required majority needed to enact constitutional amendments. Given that this presidential term would be Mahama's last, there was little reason for him to ignore these needed calls for reform. However, for many Ghanaians, it is not just the political crises that are making their nation seem on edge of decline, but economic. It is easy to see where the attitudes of discontent emerge with Ghanaian democracy, where the 2024 results of the nation saw a 60.9% turnout, a significantly lower percentage compared to the 78.9% of Ghana's 18 million registered voters who voted in 2020. indicating a lower level of confidence that Ghanaians have in the government as the primary body in which change can occur, or that their personal input into the democratic system actually has an effect on the political and economic future of the nation. By failing to address the key constituencies of the nation, most notably by failing to address Ghana's economic concerns, has allowed the potential for indifference for political action amongst the population, and young voters especially, to translate to widespread unrest and its worst forms, possibly even popular regime change. However, in a nation where democracy has faced countless challenges and threats, Ghana's own path towards electoral democracy has been and continues to be a difficult struggle. However, as the West African region and the Sahel become increasingly hostile to democracies, the existence of a stable democratic government in Ghana lights the path forward for all democracy on the African continent and beyond to follow. It just needs to ensure that it's there for the future.